They thought they were untouchable, they thought their glittering image, their curated perfection, their spotless brand could never be pierced. But in one shocking moment, a voice they never expected to turn on them, a voice with millions hanging on. Every word of voice that could shift the conversation overnight went live and detonated the truth. Joe Rogan, sitting across from his guest, barely leaning forward, eyes narrowed in that familiar mix of curiosity and disbelief, dropped the kind of statement that makes the internet collectively gasp. He said it casually, almost like he couldn't quite believe it himself, but there it was. Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds connected to something so controversial, so ugly, that the very idea of it didn't match the pristine Hollywood facade they've built over the years, and the timing could not have been worse. This wasn't a quiet whisper in a back room. This wasn't an anonymous tweet. This was on one of the most listened to platforms in the world, and within minutes clips were everywhere: TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, all ablaze with the soundbite, and the caption screamed, "You won't believe what Joe Rogan just said about Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds." Story was already teetering. Before this, for months, insiders had been whispering that something was off behind the scenes, that their carefully controlled media narrative was beginning to crack, and that a series of legal entanglements and alleged behind-the-scenes power plays were quietly painting a much darker picture than the one their fans had in mind. But now all of that was colliding with a force so public, so unavoidable, that even their most loyal defenders couldn't pretend not to see it. Joe didn't just speak in vague terms, he laid out a pattern of behavior that connected dots others had been too afraid to put together, and while he didn't drop every name in the chain, the implication was enough for people to start digging, and when people start digging, in Hollywood it never stays clean for long. This is where the energy shifts. This is where the questions stop being whispered and start being shouted, because suddenly, the stakes have changed. Suddenly, Blake and Ryan aren't just fighting a rumor. They're fighting a narrative set loose by someone whose audience dwarfs entire news networks. The power in that moment was seismic, and you could feel the ripples spreading in real time as reactions poured in from celebrities, journalists, and fans alike. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. What Rogan revealed didn't come from thin air. According to sources close to the situation, he had been sitting on pieces of this puzzle for weeks, maybe months, waiting until the right conversation, the right guest, the right moment to let it spill. And when it did, it wasn't just about the headline, it was about the way he framed it. The way he made it sound like the truth had been hiding in plain sight. This gave weight to accusations that might have otherwise been dismissed as baseless internet chatter, and for Blake and Ryan, that was the worst-case scenario. Because now they weren't just dealing with critics, they were dealing with an avalanche. Within hours, their PR teams were in overdrive, scrambling to put together a response. But here's the problem: you can't easily no comment your way out of something this viral, this sticky. The internet thrives on a mix of outrage and curiosity, and Rogan had just fed both on a silver platter, and you could sense it in the way the conversation started twisting. People weren't just asking if it was true, they were starting to act like it already was. In Hollywood, image is currency, and Blake and Ryan had built theirs to perfection. But this revelation, this moment, threatened to strip away the shine in a way few scandals can, because it didn't just target their personal lives, it cut at the perception of who they are as public figures. The wholesome, witty power couple suddenly looked like people capable of pulling strings in ways no one wanted to believe. And as the night went on, more voices joined in confirming little details, adding context, hinting at stories that hadn't yet been told. And the real danger wasn't even in what Joe Rogan said, it was in what he left unsaid. The gaps were the most dangerous part, because the internet filled them in with theories, wild but compelling theories that spread faster than any official statement ever could. And with each hour that passed, the pressure mounted, because now the question wasn't just what did Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds allegedly do, it was what would they do next to try to control the damage, and would that attempt at control only make things worse? And as you're about to see in the next part, the moves they made in the immediate aftermath only fueled the fire. And as the world sat stunned by the shockwaves Joe Rogan had just unleashed live on air, Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds could not hide the cracks in their perfect public image anymore, because suddenly this was no longer about glossy red carpet appearances or charming interviews or the curated brand they had so carefully maintained over years. This was about real questions, real allegations, and real consequences. And when a voice as influential as Rogan's asks those questions, you can feel the cultural needle shift in real time. You could almost see it happening, the way social media timelines began to flood within seconds. Clips from the podcast exploding across platforms like wildfire, being dissected, slowed down, analyzed frame By frame, every eyebrow raise, every pause in Joe's voice treated like an investigative clue, and in that moment the comfortable distance that Blake and Ryan had always enjoyed between their personal lives and the public scrutiny seemed to collapse entirely. Suddenly, it felt like everyone had permission to question them, not just as actors, not just as celebrities, but as people who might have been hiding things from the very audience that adored them. And the strange thing was this wasn't just about one revelation, it was the tone, the way Joe didn't sound like he was just repeating a rumor. He sounded like he knew something more, something bigger, something he couldn't quite say yet, and that implication alone was enough to set the industry ablaze. Because here's the truth, Joe Rogan is not just any commentator, he's a cultural amplifier. The kind of figure who can take a whisper and turn it into a roar overnight, and the fact that he chose to aim that power at Blake and Ryan specifically sent one very clear message to Hollywood: no one is untouchable. And as you watch the media ecosystem spin out, you could sense that journalists, bloggers, even other celebrities were waiting to see what happened next. Because if Joe was willing to go there, others might follow, and that's where the tension began to thicken. Because behind the scenes, sources claimed that PR teams were scrambling emails, flying phone calls being made at midnight, crisis managers trying to get ahead of whatever narrative was forming. But it's hard to get ahead of something when you don't know exactly what's coming, when you don't know if the person who just exposed you is more in the chamber, ready to fire. And what made this even more explosive was the timing. This didn't happen in a vacuum. This happened in the middle of other controversies swirling around Blake and Ryan: lawsuits, allegations about behind-the-scenes smear campaigns, whispers about shady deals. And once those threads began to intertwine in the public's mind, it created a perfect storm, a moment where separate stories merged into one massive question: what exactly is going on with Blake, Lively, and Ryan Reynolds? Because for years, they had been able to keep their hands clean publicly, even when drama touched their orbit. But now their names were at the center of the fire, and the people stoking those flames weren't anonymous trolls. They were powerful voices like Rogan. And yet, as dangerous as the situation was, there was also an undeniable sense of fascination. The public loves a downfall, but they love a mystery even more, and this had all the elements of one: a high-profile couple adored by millions, a sudden break in their image, a truth hinted at but not yet fully revealed, and a cultural figure with a massive platform dropping breadcrumbs without giving away the full loaf. And that's where Rogan is a master. He knows how to hold an audience in suspense, how to give just enough to make you lean forward, but not enough to let you lean back in comfort. And now millions were leaning forward, collectively waiting for the next sentence, the next episode, the next drop of information that could tip this entire thing from suspicion into full-scale scandal. But here's where things take a darker turn, because once that seed of doubt is planted, once the idea that maybe these two aren't who they seem takes root, it grows fast and it grows wild, and suddenly people start digging, people start connecting dots that may or may not be connected at all. And in the age of social media, perception can become reality faster than the truth can catch up, and Blake and Ryan were now in a fight, not just for their reputations, but for control of their own narrative. Because once it slips from your hands, it really comes back. And this is where the panic started to show subtle signs. First, in the carefully worded social media posts, the ones that looked like normal updates but were clearly attempts to distract from the bigger conversation. Then in the sudden cancellations of appearances, explained away as scheduling conflicts, but which insiders whispered were about avoiding difficult questions. And all the while, Rogan said nothing more. He just let the echo of his first revelation ring out. And the silence that followed was deafening. And maybe that's the cruelest part, the waiting. Because if he drops another bomb, it could finish them. But if he doesn't, the speculation will still gnaw away at their image, day by day, rumor by rumor, headline by headline. And they can't publicly attack him either, because that would make the story even bigger. So instead, they are trapped, forced to play defense against an opponent who hasn't even shown all his cards yet. And for a couple used to controlling their public perception with precision, that loss of control might be the most terrifying thing of all, because once you lose it in this industry, you rarely ever get it back. And as the days tick by without resolution, it's becoming clear that this isn't just a bad press cycle. This could be the beginning of a much bigger unraveling, one that even their most loyal fans might not be able to ignore. And now the conversation shifts, because while the first wave of shock was about Joe Rogan actually saying their names on air, the second wave is about what those words actually implied. And make no mistake, it was not just casual gossip. This was not some offhand remark over coffee. This was Joe Rogan connecting dots that millions of people had suspected, but never dared to say out loud, and in the hours after the clip went viral, entire online communities began dissecting every syllable, every pause, every glance between Joe and his guest, as if the truth was hidden somewhere between the words and the silence. And for Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, this meant one thing: the narrative was no longer theirs to control, because for years they had curated their image like an art form, polished, calculated, untouchable. But now the paint was cracking, and beneath it was something raw and unfiltered, and the world was hungry to see more. And the irony was not lost on anyone that the same couple who had weaponized charm in interviews now found themselves disarmed by the most dangerous weapon of all: authenticity. And that authenticity wasn't theirs, it belonged to Joe Rogan in that moment. And when he leaned forward in his chair, lowering his voice just slightly the way he does when he wants the listener to lean in, you could feel the collective inhale of millions of viewers, and the weight of his next sentence landed like a meteor, because he said, "There's a lot of stuff you don't see about these Hollywood power couples, and some of it's not pretty." And that was it. No names, no direct accusations, just a breadcrumb big enough to feed the internet for days. And in the hours after, you could see the ripple effect play out in real time on social media. Clips of old interviews resurfaced, timelines were dissected, obscure incidents from years ago were pulled back into the spotlight. Fans became amateur detectives, piecing together a puzzle they weren't even sure how to answer. And yet, the more they searched, the more it felt like they were onto something. And the pressure on Blake and Ryan intensified, because here's the thing about a story: once it's out of your hands, it grows its own legs, it runs in directions you can't predict, and suddenly things you thought were buried forever claw their way back to the surface. And behind closed doors, the mood in the Lively Reynolds household was anything but calm. According to sources close to the couple, the calls to their publicists were frantic, the emails to their legal teams marked urgent. There were discussions about crisis management, strategies about whether to issue a statement or let it blow over. But the problem was, this was not the kind of storm you could just wait out, because Joe Rogan's audience is not the Hollywood press. They are not bound by publicists or red carpet diplomacy. They are everyday people who love a good mystery and who will not stop digging until they find answers. And that relentless curiosity is exactly what makes a revelation like this so dangerous, because it doesn't just live in one news cycle. It evolves, it mutates, it becomes part of the culture. And while all of this was unfolding, an entirely different narrative began to gain traction, one that painted Joe Rogan not as an instigator, but as someone who had simply pulled back the curtain on something bigger, something systemic. And suddenly the conversation was no longer just about Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds. It was about the culture of secrecy in Hollywood, about the way certain people always seem to come out clean no matter what they're accused of. And that was the part that scared their team the most, because once the conversation shifts from the individual to the system, you're no longer fighting for your own reputation, you're fighting against the tide of public distrust. And here's where it gets even more complicated, because in the days that followed, rumors started swirling that Joe Rogan might have even more information, that what he said on air was just the tip of the iceberg. And whether or not that was true didn't matter, because the belief was enough to keep the story alive. Every podcast appearance, every Instagram post, every cryptic tweet. And here's where it stopped being just another celebrity headline and transformed into a genuine cultural flashpoint, because the moment Joe Rogan's clip hit the wider public, the ripple effects were not contained to Hollywood gossip circles anymore. This went global instantly, and the calls, the texts, the panicked strategy meetings inside the Reynolds Lively camp began to spill out through carefully placed leaks that hinted at just how off balance they were suddenly forced to become. You could almost picture the scene in your mind: Blake at the long glass dining table, phone in one hand, pacing barefoot across polished marble floors; Ryan in another room, on his laptop, furiously emailing their publicist team in bold red caps lock. This needs to be stopped, because the truth about Rogan's platform is it doesn't just reach millions, it reaches the kind of millions that stick to a story once they hear it. That debate in that studio had the weight of permanence, and suddenly all the Hollywood sheen in the world couldn't outgloss the raw reality that Joe had just planted a very dangerous seed in the public consciousness. But here's the part that rattled them even more: it wasn't only Rogan's words that had power. It was the massive wave of guest commentary piling on from influencers, analysts, and even a handful of former Hollywood insiders, who began sharing their own anecdotes in a tone that felt suspiciously coordinated, as though a long simmering undercurrent of resentment against the Lively Reynolds image was finally breaking the surface. People who once smiled in interviews now spoke cryptically about behind-the-scenes behavior, about business deals that went sour, about promises that were made and never kept, and the comment sections were turning into open season. The narrative had shifted, and you could almost sense the desperation as their team scrambled to push counter stories into circulation, but every attempt felt weaker than the momentum of the clip that now seemed to live everywhere. And then the legal angle began to develop, because somewhere between their private calls and the public meltdown in entertainment, law analysts dropped a thread breaking down how certain details in Rogan's conversation could potentially open the door to depositions, subpoenas, or at the very least formal discovery if anyone chose to pursue the matter in court. That was when fans realized this wasn't just another celebrity getting roasted. Online there were stakes here, tangible stakes, and once that idea caught fire, the conspiracy theories took over Reddit and TikTok. People connecting dots between recent moves Blake and Ryan had made, including a sudden shuttering of a minor production arm and the quiet dissolution of an LLC nobody paid attention to until now. Meanwhile, the press began circling like vultures. TMZ, ILLUGEDLY had a source inside the very PR firm they hired to handle the crisis, and word leaked that multiple mainstream outlets had submitted formal interview requests to Joe Rogan himself, not because they thought he'd spill anything more, but because they wanted that visual of him smirking into a mic. When asked if he stood by his comments, that image alone could trigger another explosion across platforms, and that is exactly the kind of thing Blake and Ryan feared most, because they had built their entire careers on controlling their narrative, on never letting the chaos of public perception run free without a guiding hand. But this time the guiding hand wasn't theirs. As the hours turned into days, the online response stopped being reactive and started to solidify into a broader conversation about what their brand really stood for. Influencers on YouTube and Instagram began dissecting old interviews and red carpet clips, searching for micro-expressions and offhand remarks that could be framed as evidence of a hidden side. The viral edits were brutal, perfectly timed freeze frames paired with captions like "This didn't age well," and millions of views were racking up so fast it was like watching a slow-motion implosion they couldn't delete. And with each passing day, the algorithms pushed the controversy further up the feed until people who had never cared about Hollywood gossip were suddenly weighing in with opinions, because it was no longer about celebrity. It was about authenticity versus performance. And here's where the most ironic twist unfolded, because while Blake and Ryan were trying to put out the fire, Joe Rogan himself barely addressed the uproar beyond a casual throwaway line in his next episode, saying something like "People are free to make up their own minds," which in internet speak is equivalent to pouring gasoline on the embers, because it signaled to his audience that he wasn't backing down, wasn't retracting, and wasn't afraid of whatever might come next. And that one casual shrug of defiance became the moment their camp realized they weren't up against a traditional opponent. This wasn't someone who cared about being invited to premieres or keeping their name polished in the industry. This was someone untouchable by the usual Hollywood levers of control. So by the time the weekend rolled around and the think pieces were already labeling this the Rogan ripple, the mood in the Lively Reynolds orbit had shifted from defensive to quietly panicked. The private jet flight logs were being tracked. Online speculation was that they had flown to meet with crisis lawyers in person, and the hush-hush dinner sightings in New York and LA only fueled the theory that something bigger was in motion, because when the richest and most image-conscious couple in Hollywood suddenly go dark for more than 48 hours, the internet fills that silence with stories of its own making, and those stories, once they stick, are nearly impossible to shake off. And perhaps that is why industry insiders are saying in hushed tones that the real storm hasn't even started yet, that what we have seen so far is just the surface disruption before the deeper battle over reputation control truly begins. Because if there is one thing history has shown about these high-stakes public implosions, it's that once the court of public opinion turns, the only way back is through a fight so big, so undeniable, that it rewrites the narrative entirely. But the question now is, do Blake and Ryan have that kind of fight left in them? Or is this the moment when the illusion finally cracks for good? And so here we are, standing in the aftermath of a storm that no one could have predicted, a storm that didn't begin in a courtroom or on a movie set, but on a live stage with cameras rolling, microphones hot, and millions watching, as Joe Rogan looked directly into that lens and spoke words that carried the weight of truth, or at least the weight of a truth that Hollywood has worked for years to bury. And as those words reverberated Across social media, across newsrooms, across the private circles of the elite, something shifted, because it wasn't just that Rogan had the reach to make this go viral, it was that he had the courage to say the quiet part out loud, the things whispered in green rooms, the warnings exchanged in hushed tones, the rumors that everyone claimed to dismiss, but secretly knew were too precise to be fiction. And now Blake, Lively and Ryan Reynolds were no longer untouchable, no longer protected by the curated sheen of brand deals, press tours, and hand-picked interviews. The questions were too big, the accusations too sharp, the connections too damning, and as the news cycle churned faster and faster, something else began to happen. The allies who once defended them without hesitation began to fall silent. Some unfollowed quietly, some released vague statements about being blindsided, others simply stopped mentioning their names altogether. It was as if the industry could sense that a tide was turning, that the safest place to be was as far from this firestorm as possible. But here's the thing about truth: once it's out, you can't pull it back in. You can't rewind a live stream. You can't erase a viral clip. You can't pretend the public didn't hear what it heard. And whether you believe Joe Rogan was exposing them or simply speculating, the fact remained that he had cracked the perfect surface and shown that beneath the perfection was something darker, more complicated, more dangerous. And as fans turned into investigators, as journalists scrambled to verify details, as old clips and interviews were re-examined with fresh suspicion, the narrative control that Blake and Ryan once wielded began slipping from their hands. Now they could try to push back, they could issue statements, hire crisis teams, demand retractions, but deep down they had to know that the damage was already done, because in the court of public opinion, silence can be read as guilt, and too much talking can sound like panic. Either way, the world was watching, waiting, and wondering what move they would make next. But one thing was certain: after Joe Rogan's explosive reveal, there was no going back, no quiet return to business as usual, no safe space left in the spotlight. They once owned only the knowledge that the truth, or the perception of it, is the most dangerous force in Hollywood, and now it was aimed squarely at them.